seminars for UNE. It's called the X-FactOR. And this is really the brainchild of the Dean of Medicine and Health, Associate Dean Research for Medicine and Health, and Professor Miff Maple. It represents an opportunity to learn about the research happening across faculties, thus the X-FactOR, cross-faculty label. We'll be providing a forum to bring external speakers to the university, a forum for researchers within the university to talk to each other as well. And we'd love to get your feedback on the format for this and any ideas for future speakers. So the first speaker on this series, and one of the instigators of the whole X-FactOR, is Professor Miff Maple. Miff's the director of the Manna Institute, and she actually brought about the institute through her leadership in collaboration with a number of other universities through the RUN network. And Miff and her colleagues secured Commonwealth funding, and that's an institute up and running. I'm very happy and very privileged to be the chair of the leadership group, as I mentioned. The Institute emphasises the importance of growing the depth and impact of research in regional universities in mental health, and has a very strong emphasis on the involvement of people with lived experience and involvement of Indigenous Australians. Professor Miff Maple is a social work professor at our university, and has been for over 20 years. Miff as a researcher and focus on trauma and loss, with a particular emphasis on understanding risk and resilience following exposure to suicide. From 2015 to 2021, Miff was the co-chair of the International Association of Suicide Prevention, Bereavement and Postvention Special Interest Group. More recently, I was very pleased to hear last week actually that Miff has been invited by the Honourable Mark Butler, Minister for Health, to be part of a newly formed mental health reform advisory committee. So congratulations. And I think that's a real testament to Miff's expertise and the respect that the health system in Australia holds for Miff. I'll hand over to Miff at the end. I'm going to field some questions. So after Miff's finished speaking, I'll read out questions and people can add those into the chat. And I hope you all enjoy this presentation, and over to you, Miff. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. I'll just share my screen. If I can find the right buttons there. Okay, that should be good to go there now. So similarly, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which UNE sits, the Anaiwan people, also the Gumbunya people, the traditional owners of the land where I live, work and play. I pay my respects to elders and leaders, past, present and emerging, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people present today. Similarly to Chris, I also want to acknowledge the tremendous health burden on our First Australians, the ongoing impact of colonisation, which continue in the lead up to the Voice referendum and the discussions in the media presently. And I just want to remind everybody to be kind and generous to each other in our conversations and respectful of those who are deeply hurting. So for those of you who know me well, you'll know I'm pretty hopeless when it comes to pop culture and current TV shows. So when the name of these series of seminars came out as X-FactOR, I did have to do some Googling and some asking of others about what the X-FactOR was. A little distressed to find out it's about singing, because my singing voice is worse than my knowledge of pop culture. And no doubt if I started singing, you'd do the get her out of here right now button on the stage. So we'll move past that and instead move on to UNE being a pretty significant part of my life. So for those of you who grew up in Armidale, it's not surprising that UNE is part of your life. Everybody knows the building is on the hill or has a family member employed at UNE. But I grew up in Sydney. So I came to Armidale many, many times. I came from res schools, as they were known back then. And the first time I wore the graduation gown in this photo, I was about 8 years old. And it was my mum's graduation. And I was again visiting UNE to watch her graduate. And this photo is taken just outside of Bullamimba, where graduation still happens. So standing tall in those long black robes back then, little did I know the role that UNE would play in my future life. During the 2 decades between that photo and when I moved back to Armidale with my young son, it didn't look like to anyone that I would ever go to university, let alone survive adolescence. I went pretty seriously off the rails during that time, and I didn't manage to finish high school. The world really didn't make sense to me, and I couldn't get a grip on what I was supposed to be doing during this thing we call life. In the words of my high school year advisor, I was the least likely to succeed in my year at school. This messy adolescence really meant that when I worked out what it was that I did want to do with my life, I had to find alternate ways to access education. And so I worked full-time to fund my undergraduate studies at UNSW. I then did my PhD as a single mum with 2 young boys, and I have to say I was living in poverty on a PhD scholarship at UNE. I wrote the UNE social work curriculum and got our social work programs accredited in 2008, 2009 on a UNE contract position with my baby daughter strapped to my chest. So why share all of this with you? Not only is this messiness of life outside of university very common amongst UNE students, and part of the reason I feel so indebted to UNE's inclusive education and alternate entry pathways, this messiness also taught me early on the invaluable lessons about the importance of looking past the assumptions that we make about people when we meet them. Some may have an easier road than you, and some others may have a harder route. Some may have a whole lot going on behind them that you have absolutely no idea about, and all of us have our strengths and limitations, and at different times these are flourishing and stretched. So given that this is the first X-FactOR seminar for UNE, and I'm totally honoured to be the first person presenting, I really wanted to talk about how I do the research I do and why I do it, and how these shape the foundation beliefs of my work. I want to give a couple of examples of projects where myself and my colleagues have been involved in deep collaboration with industry, and really show how out of little things, big things grow. Then I want to talk about the Manna Institute that Chris talked a little bit about in his introduction, and the opportunities that this affords to all of us. And I'm hoping that one of the co-hosts is admitting the people in the waiting room whilst I'm talking. So I do research broadly under the banner of mental health. And at the highest level, this can include anything about how we think and feel about our lives through to severe and persistent mental illness. More specifically, most of my research has been dedicated to understanding and preventing suicide and the impact of suicide on others. Now, I am going to talk a little bit about suicide over the next 10 minutes or so, and if this makes you feel uncomfortable or you're feeling vulnerable, please feel free to leave the session. If you need to reach out to family members or friends, please do so. The Employee Assistance Program is available, or Lifeline on 13 11 14. Suicide is a vital gauge on the health of our community. Like so many of the big challenges facing contemporary societies, suicide is really complex. It's so complex that issues like this are often referred to as wicked problems. Rather than these being evil, wicked refers to the complexity of the problem and their resistance to change. Solving or managing these requires new ways of thinking, new ways of working, to reduce the significant health and social care problems faced by those most vulnerable in our communities. Throughout Australia and in our rural towns, we're faced with changing environmental and economic conditions, chronic and complex health conditions, ageing populations, the outcome of intergenerational trauma on our First Nations people, coupled with increasing drug and alcohol use, domestic violence, mental health, housing insecurity, cost of living, all contributing to distress. These challenges appear insurmountable. We often think about these challenges in the domain of health professionals and from a kind of fix it when it's broken mentality. So for example, everybody will be familiar with going to the doctor, sort of describing all of your symptoms. They're sitting behind the desk, trying to work out how what you're experiencing fits with diagnostic criteria and what tests they might need to do to prove their theory. Then once proved, they'll prescribe some medication to fix the problem. Yet we have a myriad of challenges facing farmers, ecologists, school kids, unemployed people, people with disability, chronic conditions, none of which can be solved with a pill. And often these conditions and experiences start with an emotional event. It might be a traumatic situation, it might be something unpredicted, but something that leaves us feeling out of control. For some, these events can start a spiral that might become a tsunami of distress. Since the pandemic, new vulnerabilities have been emerging across the lifespan and distress is heightened amongst many people. By far, the majority of these vulnerabilities are due to the social and economic pressures rather than a mental illness, which will and continue to lead to health vulnerabilities. If we look back over centuries at points of global unrest, we'll know that this is likely to continue for a decade or so until we return to some period of stability. That all means we really need to be on the front foot and we need to be on it now. This is not just out there, it's also here at UNE. Following the release of the EY report into UNE Culture and Safety last week, there'll be many people amongst us who are very highly distressed with that content and the events that are laid out in that report. And at different times, we all need extra support and time out, and it's important that we recognise that within our own colleagues. In my area of work, I see the most vulnerable, the most hurt, the most threatened in our community, and that's really what suicide is. It's a hopeless, helpless, and very lonely place. But it's also a place of survival, a place of resilience, and a place of inspiration. Whilst for the most part, I'm still trying to work out what it is that I'm good at, I do know that I'm good at one thing, and that is really sitting with people in their dark times, in the mess of their life, with all of the shit that is sitting around them. I can sit there and I can listen to what they have to say, and I can share silent spaces, and I can gently ask really tricky questions. Over time, I've come to learn that not everybody can do this. Many people want to fill the spaces with chatter. They come up with quick solutions and never really listen to the words that the person in front of them is saying. Not long ago, I spoke with a woman, let's call her Louise, in this situation. So Louise is now in her 70s. I was speaking with her because 18 months prior, her 47-year-old son had died by suicide. He died from insurmountable and overwhelming sadness. Yet up until 2 years before his death, he'd been a successful and contributing member of the community, a caring and loving son and brother. However, all the health professionals that he came in contact with could only see the depression. All Louise wanted was for them to see her son, the boy that she had grown into a man. But the man was being destroyed by depression. For her, throughout her journey, supporting him in his journey through the mental health system, the one thing that really made all the difference was a peer worker in the mental health facility where he was, who advocated for her to enable extra visits with her son in a way that met his needs. This enabled her to spend extra precious moments with him before he died. And that kindness that was shown to her is something she can now hold on to in her memories of her son. The kindness helps her with her grief. And she knows that somebody else understood that her son was more than the depression that could be seen from the outside. Beyond that gift of kindness, the worker also heard Louise's needs, listened to what was important for her and her son, and advocated for her on her behalf when she could not. Around the same time as that conversation, I was leading a team working on a review for a large national mental health foundation. The task was that they wanted to know what prevents suicide. So we did a rapid review to inform them, and we made some pretty sensible recommendations. But it's also clear from the outset that there isn't one answer to this question. If there was, we wouldn't still all be asking, are you okay? Which, by the way, you should ask, and ask it often. If you're concerned about somebody, tell them you're concerned and ask them outright what is going on for them. There is no answer to what works to prevent suicide. And with over 50 years of research, predicting suicide is still no better than chance. We do know that asking about suicide does no harm, and that through asking, we can connect people into the support that they need. Continuing to research suicide as a psychiatric or medical problem to be solved is not generating new and helpful strategies. While some people are still working on trying to solve this problem of suicide through that lens, it seemed to me that there was a vast chasm between a very real, intimate and lived experience and the medical paradigm that has dominated suicide research. For me, from the start, researching in the world of suicide meant that I needed to be up close and personal, walking alongside people with this experience, talking to those who have been there, looking over the edge and into the abyss. Taking this person-centered approach and being informed by people's lived experiences, we now know that suicide is not present or absent. We can't, from one risk assessment performed once off or even periodically by a medical or health professional, know where people are on that continuum and when that might shift for them. For others, suicide will be once off. To understand that diversity, we need to understand from the individual their suicide story. I've never been a researcher sitting in my office trying to come up with new ideas to put in for the next grant opportunity that comes out. How often have we all heard, oh, did you see that grant opportunity that's come out? Let's put something together. We're like a year behind if that's how we're approaching a grant opportunity. Instead, I've embedded myself in industry, and well before there was any metrics to try and measure this, I did it because it made sense, not because ERA started to ask about what our impact of our research was. Back in 2004, when my employment at UNE was insecure and contract-based, I applied to become an official visitor under the New South Wales Mental Health Act. This role is embedded within the legislation to ensure the rights and dignity of those being held and treated under the Mental Health Act, those for whom rights have been removed to ensure that treatment for their mental illness can be administered. There's only one group in our community who also have their rights removed, and they're convicted criminals. So this role for those who are being treated under the Mental Health Act is vital to ensure those who are vulnerable receive appropriate, timely, safe, and importantly, respectful care. During the interview for that role, I was asked why, as a researcher, did I want to give my time to do this? My answer was pretty simple. In my view, the role is one of the most important in the community. At the same time, for me, being locked in the ward of a mental health facility once a month kept me pretty real and kept me pretty grounded in everything that I do. I went on to stay in that position for 9 years, even as my position at UNE became more permanent. I became, during that time, a member of the statewide advisory committee, which was tasked with reporting to the New South Wales Minister of Health directly. In that role, I could use my research skills to collate information in new ways. I reviewed patterns in the data that we were collecting, and I advocated with that group for changes and updates to policies where there was negative impact on people who were being treated under the Mental Health Act. This work isn't accounted for in any UNE workload model, but for me, it's work that, like this, that informs me as a researcher and ensures that I remain true to those who I seek to assist through the work that I do. So my work is almost always in collaboration with industry and or people with lived experience. I honestly could count on one hand the projects that I've done that haven't been developed from a collaborative conversation and developed as a joint project. It's not so surprising now, and everyone will be being asked what industry partners you have for your research and the like. In the past, it really was less often, and particularly in mental health work. It takes a long time to do this work and a lot of goodwill to build relationships where parties have really different priorities. So I wanted to provide a couple of quick examples of what this looks like. So the first example is with Lifeline. So back in like 2015, the fledgling Lifeline Research Foundation asked me along to a meeting with one of their service providers through Lifeline at Mid Coast, where a community member had come forward to ask for a service for people who had attempted suicide. There wasn't any money, but there was already some goodwill. The foundation director and I were both directors of Suicide Prevention Australia, so we got to know each other through that peak body work, again, which is voluntary and out of hours. That person that had come forward to ask for a service wasn't sure how or they would get one, and Mid Coast Lifeline weren't sure how they would deliver one, nor what evidence there was and the safety of doing so. So together we started to work out how we might do this, and we looked to a similar group that had been running in the US, and so they also partnered in this project to then deliver a psychoeducational group for people who had attempted suicide. So we collaboratively did this from the beginning. We co-ideated, we co-designed, we co-produced, and we co-evaluated the entire program. We had a program logic that we kept updating as we learnt more from each other and learnt more from delivering the program and evaluating the program as time went on. So fast forward 9 years, we just finished this project. It was pretty small, but it's one of the most messy and time-consuming but interesting projects that I've been involved in. And during that time, we've had a number of other UNE researchers join the team. Tanya Pearce did use this as a case study for her PhD on co-creation. The funds over the time for this whole project are probably less than $200,000, but the outcomes from it are priceless. There's several key papers that have been published. There's several more that are in various forms of preparation. The data has been reanalysed on a project commissioned by the Prime Minister's Suicide Prevention Advisor and informed her final advice to the Prime Minister. And the support group is now offered through many sites across Lifeline centres throughout Australia. The program's been accredited through the Suicide Prevention Quality Assurance Program, which requires all programs to be evaluated before they are entered into the register. We've also developed incredibly strong links with Lifeline centres, as well as with Lifeline Australia, and are working with them on many other community embedded projects across Australia. So this was all about people needing a service to support them, not about us as researchers, but it meets all of the requirements of strong quality research. Years back, in the absence, actually I'll just go back for a minute, in the absence of any guidance of expectations about research, a prior mentor told me to do the best research that I could do and the rest would follow. By that, what he meant was that the metrics would follow what I was doing if I was doing high quality research. If I was doing low quality research, it would never amount to anything except essentially waste my time and waste the time of participants in research. I think the Lifeline example that I'm giving here about Eclipse is a really good example of that. What's more in this example, because we're researchers, we're noticing patterns in the data as they're emerging and we start to interrogate them. So in this, we used a mixed methods approach. We were using routinely collected data that the facilitators would collect, and then we would collect follow-up data, and we would do some in-depth interviews and focus groups with participants. And what we started to notice is that there was people that were returning to subsequent groups. So this was an 8-week structured psychoeducational group. Why is it that people would come back to subsequent groups when the curriculum didn't really on face value offer anything more to people? But yet these returners seem to be getting something from returning to subsequent groups. So what was that? So this did lead to spin-off data analysis. We had a look at who had returned, and from the beginning of data collection in 2017, of the 40 Eclipse groups that had been delivered across Lifeline sites and the 130 people that had participated in the research, obviously not all participated in research that went to the groups, we identified 32 participants who had returned to subsequent groups. So interestingly, there was no significant differences that we could find between those who started off and subsequently did go to another group or did not. But at T3, we noticed some different, so that's at 1 month follow-up. We did start to notice some differences around coping. And so that was pretty important to us to think about, well, why is it that those who don't need a second go or more of this group develop more coping strategies during the group than those who need top-ups or to return? So we undertook some qualitative focus groups around during the final phases of the evaluation to understand this a little bit more. We identified some really important points. So the people that returned wanted more time to look at the tools that they were being given to cope better with life and manage their suicidal distress. They felt that there was an ongoing process of learning. There was an opportunity to self-destigmatize. It gave them safe spaces to rehearse their story, and that repetitive learning allowed them extra time to think about what suicide means in their life. And I think this quote is really indicative of something that all of us, whether or not we've experienced personally any distress or suicidal distress ourselves, is that you wouldn't stop going to the gym just when you get fit. You're going to keep going to keep that fitness going. And I think it's a really important point. And what that's helped us do in this situation is continue to work with Lifeline around what does it look like for returners? Do we need some sort of other group that they can go into? Is there a need in terms of the people that attend the first time to have more people that have been there before, or is there a disadvantage for new attendees? So a whole lot of questions come out of this just from us looking at these patterns as they're emerging from the data as we go. In sum, this long project has been running for a long time. There's vulnerability and trust amongst this broader team, and that's really ensured that this safe space to have challenging conversations, to build this evidence, has been able to serve and fill a gap in the community. So from this project and others, we're really clear now that for some, suicide is once off, but for many, suicide is a constant in their life. So why then do we have services that are mostly static? Inpatient services or community mental health treatment, services that are limited to a particular time period after a suicide event, or nothing at all when you're seemingly well from the outside? Why don't we have programs that offer respite and quiet caring spaces when times are challenging but don't require hospitalisation? And how would we scale up those that we are trialling in different sites across Australia, across regional Australia and its broad geographic expanse? These are all super important considerations. And as my work in the suicide aftercare space has grown, and acknowledging the important work and role that Sarah Wayland has played in this particular work with me, I was invited to be part of a national conversation on aftercare last year. And it turns out that Sarah and I have been in some way involved in the evaluation of all but 2 aftercare services across Australia being funded by the Commonwealth and state or industry. This bird-eye view without influence or need to align with one service in any way more than another was really useful into that national conversation, and that was fed back into the federal government's Universal Aftercare initiative. So not to say that money for research isn't vital. Across this example of aftercare work that I've been describing, the total amount that we've probably brought into UNE is around 500,000. All of that has been directly funded by industry. What we've never had to do is sit around for months and months and months preparing a Category 1 grant that would maybe have a 10% chance of success and may never get off the ground. So all of that time would have been wasted. That's several hundreds of thousands of dollars in wasted wages of me and my team for something that may never come. Instead, we've spent our time building these relationships with industry and alongside people with lived experience, and planning now for an agenda that will be successful in Category 1 grants. The evidence that we've formed in doing this developmental work has still had direct impact on policy through the final advice to the Prime Minister on suicide prevention. It's been used in the Towards Zero Suicide Initiative in New South Wales, Universal Aftercare Initiative at the Commonwealth level, and it's been used to inform the ongoing development of aftercare services for people following a suicide, attempt, and we have a PhD graduate and many papers that are informing academia more broadly. Relationships, though, are super tricky, whether they're personal relationships, work relationships, or research relationships. Our needs differ from the direct need of industry when we come at this from researchers. Their timelines are wildly different to ours. Industry are trying to keep their business afloat. They're trying to meet demands of people they serve daily. They're often responsive to new funding to fund new service provision or to continue funding the service provision that they're already doing. Research and evaluation for them is often further down the tree, even though often, and they know the importance of it, trying to direct time aside to that is really difficult. They certainly don't always have time for blue sky and long-term planning that takes years of research. So while we can come up with great ideas, they're getting on with the job. But in doing so, when we're thinking about different ways of working, we're also thinking about how we can use evidence to inform decisions that they're making, as well as making new connections. And we can look beyond that current thinking to blue sky thinking. And that's really where new connections are made. And it really helps us to think about how might we challenge these wicked, intractable problems that we have across our community. So we have to work together to achieve success, in my view. It's not always clean and simple. And I wanted to give another really brief example of what it looks like to do this in a timeline with another partner that I've worked in detail with, Standby Response Service. So Standby is the National Suicide Bereavement Initiative, and they were created in about 2003, and I've been friends with them since their inception. We became friends because the original national manager was presenting on the last day of a conference in the last session in a room that nobody could find, and it was me and her together. So, you know, we got talking as the only Australians at an American conference in the back dark hallways. None of the friendship between this service and I has been paid. I've been working alongside them for 20 years. I helped write a national bereavement strategy for the federal government with them, never saw the light of day. They continued to grow. We applied for an ARC linkage, took a lot of time to get there, wasn't successful. We didn't really have the track record on the ground, but they had committed money for the linkage. And so I went on to do a small part of that project with them from that funding that they'd already committed. They weren't happy really with what came out of that. But we continued to work together. The national manager enrolled in a PhD, but she also here at UNE, she discontinued. I did evidence-informed training for them every year. We kept working. We worked on a large New South Wales health grant together. It was enormously challenging. A constant problem with their database kept coming up. We kept trying to work that out. There were lots of very difficult conversations. But beyond that, there was an agreed agenda to make sure that we were all working together to support people who had been exposed to suicide death. Recently, a change in leadership has occurred there. They're now really looking at how they do things differently. They've funded a PhD industry scholarship here at UNE, and Bess Jackson is undertaking that. She's just gone through her confirmation of candidature, and she's starting to look at the sorts of outcome measures that Standby can use to better inform their evidence. During this time, as I said, it was a bit tricky, but I was still really committed to working on this issue of how do we better support people bereaved by suicide. So without Standby, but still keeping friendly with Standby, I worked with other partners to look at a brief mobile phone intervention for people bereaved by suicide. So bringing on partners from ANU and Everymind, we put together a randomised control trial for this intervention. Even though we weren't working with the national group that are providing services in this space, we continued to work in a collaborative model. So we did a systematic review. We worked and co-designed the intervention with postvention experts and with people bereaved by suicide. Then we did the RCT. We unfortunately were recruiting right at the beginning of COVID, so it wasn't quite as successful as we had have hoped. This came from a small Faculty of Medicine and Health seed grant, and then we applied for successfully a Suicide Prevention Research Fund grant, which is a Category 1 grant, to do the work. And you'll see there in the implications from the outcomes, even though there was a lot of learning and we didn't get the participation that we hoped for, and it was during COVID and it was badly COVID affected, we want to continue to work with national providers. And so Standby come up again. And so now they've seen the evidence, they've had a change of leadership, they're really interested in how they might embed a tool like this into their service provision ecosystem. And so we're looking at how do we register a Creative Commons license for this brief contact intervention so that they can then badge this for standby use, but others across the globe can also use it. So as a past Member of Parliament for the New England, Tony Windsor used to say, the world is run by those who show up. So my advice is to show up and get involved. Research takes a really long time and it takes a lot of patience. And it is not about you or your next promotion application, your grant application, or your need for a publication idea to note that you're working on something in your next PPDR discussion. We are so privileged to work in a university where we have some freedoms about the research that we do. Use these freedoms to value add beyond your next publication or conference presentation. Consider where your work and that of your colleagues and students fits in the regional, national, and international picture. How can UNE contribute to the conversation and influence policy and funding for a fairer and more just society? UNE, like all universities, has a social contract to improve society. We can only ever be judged on the ways in which our most vulnerable are treated. And we have a role to play to ensure that we are proud of how we contribute to the betterment of society. Health research at UNE is in its infancy, and I've been here for over 20 years and it's still in its infancy and has been the whole time. And that's a pretty tricky space, if I'm being honest. Many times I have considered moving to a research intensive university and benefiting from a research environment that's more vibrant and inspiring. However, that would take me from an institution that I'm committed to and I have benefited from no end. And that's well beyond the transaction of my work for my paycheck. It, by the way, would also mean that I'd be more likely to have to think about soft money and always be looking for grant money for me and my team. While I'm often in that position of looking for funding for my team, I'm in the privileged position of having a permanent position where, and many of us have, balanced academic roles where you get to work 40% of research in our jobs. Like, how lucky are we? I feel the transaction for work, for money type thing, though, is something that people are coming to feel that they deserve, and just showing up rather than taking their roles with pride and curiosity. We all need to put up our hands, be enthusiastic to create a vibrant UNE health research culture. And in my view, if UNE, as your employer, asks you to do something, you do it. And you never know where it might land you. Although I do have to admit, landing on a billboard in a paddock was not something that I expected. Nevertheless, when I was asked by the past UNE DVCR to meet with run DVCRs and senior researchers from the 7 run universities to start working on a national mental health bid, I naturally agreed. My employer asked me to do something. It's in the scope of my role. I do it. This was not about my research, nor was it about outcomes for me personally or my trajectory. This is completely about bettering mental health of regional Australians and providing a vibrant, fertile research environment for researchers, regardless of where they are on their trajectory. And so that's how Manna Institute was born. Manna Institute is funded through the Federal Government Department of Education. You'll see there the run university partners and our foundation partners in Everymind, ANU Centre for Mental Health Research, and Lifeline Direct. At Manna Institute, we work from a collaborative model. So when we were in the development of Manna Institute, we all agreed that we had to work with industry and through service providers with lived experience and the community, using our research skills to develop solutions for improving mental health in regional Australia. And through doing so, building regional mental health research workforce capacity and trajectories. This is the Manna Institute initial logic model. You'll see the demands on the left of the screen, which is that Australians living in regional Australia have greater rates of mental illness and ill health than their metropolitan counterparts. The causes are complex and multifaceted, and so the way in which we address them also need to be multifaceted. Manna is working in 4 key ways: through research and training, through research collaboration and projects, through using data and data toolkits, and through stakeholder engagement, so that we're getting the voice of research out there and influencing policy at the state, local, state and national level, and internationally through our networks. Obviously, the outputs from this are improved health outcomes, increased mental health research capacity, knowledge generation, improvement in policy and practice, and the economic benefit of doing this. This is a quick slide of where we're up to. So you'll see the kind of golden strip through the middle is about where we're up to. So we're about halfway through our initial funding. For me, this is all about sustainability. So my focus as director of Manna Institute is 100% on how do we diversify funding to make us sustainable into the future. Meanwhile, we're working on how do we work together? How do we include new people? What ways can we translate knowledge out to the community and to researchers? How do we engage people? How do we bring new researchers in? How do we move with the next cohorts of early career and mid-career researchers? And how do we keep evaluating what it is that we do? So this is kind of the bits, I guess, that are most important to those of you listening today. So how do you join? We're certainly looking at that right now. We might not always have a clear way just yet for everyone. We've just invited senior researchers across all the run universities and our partners to join, and we'll be looking for the next cohort of our early career and mid-career researchers. There's a community of practice for mental health HDR students starting up. So even though the processes might not always be completely clear or worked out just yet, as we move from startup to implementation, definitely keep your eye out, reach out, keep an eye on our socials so that you can definitely get involved. And why would you get involved other than building networks and creating more people working in your area? At a small university like UNE, where health research is in its infancy, it's likely you might be the only person working in your area. However, across the run universities and our partners, there's probably others. So we can start to form a critical mass. And what that means is when you're talking about research environment where you're going to do projects as you're applying for grants, you can write a whole lot more about a vibrant research culture. That means that the reviewers of those grants will look at your application much more favourably. There is so much in this for you. You get to build other relationships that you wouldn't otherwise. We're helping you to do that. So I started this talk with some personal insights into who I am and why I do what I do. My life and decisions and the experiences I've had, and because of those decisions, that's what drives me to start always from a point of humility and being open to experiences, being grateful for the opportunities that I have and to find ways to open opportunities for others. Manna is totally all about this. The broader Manna collaboration allows for that research environment. We have not had this before. Our foundation partners and those that we will bring on as we move from this startup to implementation and sustainability are important networks for all of you. The starting from scratch every time is really time consuming, and this allows us all to fast track some of those steps and to build new networks. So the 4 main messages that I wanted to leave with you today are: contribute to your area beyond your office or those in your virtual or literal corridor. Take time to consider your approach and ensure that you're not the centre of why you're doing what you're doing. Work collaboratively with industry and those that you are seeking to assist through your research. And finally, find somebody, preferably several, to champion who are more junior than you and have somebody who is mentoring you, who is above you. And take that opportunity both here and outside of UNE. In this way, we're all part of the rising tide to float all boats, and then we can move health research at UNE beyond its infancy. So thank you for listening to my X-FacToR. I'm glad I didn't hear any buzzers going off during that time. And yeah, I'm open to questions, Chris.
Thanks so much, Miff. That was so inspirational. I love the kind of the depth. I love the personal stories and anecdotes, but also that you're providing a really good insight for people, no matter what field they're working in, on how to have really impactful and rewarding research careers. So it was just remarkable, and thanks so much for a great presentation and being the first up. Can I ask people if you have questions that you'd like to pose to Miff, if you'd like to put some chats in the comments in the chats. So thank you for your inspiring, grounded and honest talk. It's a comment from Fincina. Can I ask Miff maybe a question? When you're thinking about engaging with industry, do you kind of draw on opportunities that present themselves, or do you think, I'd like to explore a certain realm, or I don't understand how to kind of implement a piece of knowledge, I might go and find the right industry partner to enable that? Is it, so I guess I'm asking, is it opportunistic, or is it quite directed in when you're engaging with new industry partners?
Yeah, great question, Chris. And I think it's really hard when you're starting out to work that out. So I have now more often people coming to me than I'm going out, but that's kind of an indicator of where I'm up to in my career and my grey hair. I think what's really important is to get involved in conversations from the get-go. So one of the biggest challenges, I think, at being at a regional university is getting to places where you're part of that conversation. And often that does mean that people are self-funding to get, say, to conferences or participate, but certainly making the most of those opportunities then and being part of the conversation starts it off so that you're never starting from, I'm having difficulty with this, because actually I'm already part of the conversation. I would also say that mental health and suicide prevention is a really, really small sector in Australia. And if you ever piss anybody off, they'll remember forever. And so treating everybody with kindness and gratitude is always important, and not thinking that you're better than anybody else. And I think that's where the humility bit really takes a lead role. So, participating in, if there's a peak body, in advisory groups or organising groups, getting to know people in different ways and having different conversations means that things start to emerge more organically and proactively rather than reaching out. That said, if I do need to reach out, I think people are really open to it, both industry and other academics. If somebody reaches out to me, I'm always responsive to that. I might not be the best person to answer, and I might, share that response amongst many. But I think it's really important also to feel like you can reach out. And maybe you won't get it right the first time, and maybe you'll get a cold shoulder, but continuing to do that and being curious in your questioning and respectful in where they're coming from, I think is always really important as well.
Great, thanks, Miff. We've got a question here from Sarah. One of the biggest issues in PPDR is, sorry, my screen's flipped. One of the biggest issues in PPDR is people wanting to know how to grow their networks. What's your tips for them? I guess that what you were just saying then in some way answers that question. Are there any other kind of comments on that?
Yeah, so I think, definitely talking to others and being curious, and not, I think there's from my reflections over time, there's kind of a misunderstanding that when you are doing or finished a PhD that you're kind of a real expert, and you are an expert in what you did your PhD in, for sure. And that's not to belittle the achievements of a PhD, but there's lots of people who have other ideas too. So really being open to that, and in those conversations, I think helps to build networks. And because if we go in thinking we know everything, then we're not open to hearing. And that's why I give that example early on in the presentation of Louise. Like if we're not listening to what she's saying, she's not going to get the care she wants. And it's exactly the same in research and academia. If we're not open to hearing others, we can't build networks, we can't build relationships, because they're they are, by their very nature, needing to have respect and trust, and in research, vulnerability as well. So there has to be that respect from the beginning and a level playing field. Somebody with lived experience of mental ill health or suicide has much, much, much more to offer from their perspective than I do. And if I sit and listen, I can use my knowledge to help think about what's next. But if I go in thinking I'm an expert, how do I ever open up safety for that person to discuss what's going on for them? And so I think in PPDR conversations, and certainly in people that I've line managed in the past, trying to help people think about the nuance of that. Like, what's the plan? If you're planning to, say, get a publication out or to get a grant application in, they're not going to be ways in which you can respectfully engage industry, because your need and desire is something completely different to theirs. And so you're not starting from the same point. So an early PPDR might say, I'm going to volunteer some time to get to know this industry partner. And then in 3 years, I'm going to look to a seed grant or a pilot project with them, acknowledging the time that that's going to take. I think we take far too short a view of what research is when we're working collaboratively.
Great, thank you. Another question. We're always interested in operationalizing learnings appropriate to our context. This is from Diana. In your model, who do you consider to be your end users?
Pretty much everyone, actually. So we know, for example, from nationally representative research that I've done, that over 50% of the Australian population has been impacted by suicide. And that's only people that currently have been. That will continue to grow with the 3,000 suicide deaths that happen every year in Australia. So we don't yet know who the end user is. We know that people will experience vulnerability, and somebody who in the past may have been very resilient may not be. So for me, end users is actually everybody. For the research that I do in different spheres, the end user might be much more defined. So for example, when we're thinking about aftercare services for people who have attempted suicide, the gateway there for end users really is a prior suicide attempt. But there's a whole community around those people too that we need to think about: their carers, the people that love them, the people that are trying to support them. And so, yeah, for me, end users is kind of everybody. And that's not the same for every area of research. And it does differ depending on which work I'm doing. But being mindful of end users, I think, at the starting point is super important, because then you know you're having conversations with the right people.
Thank you. I guess from your example as well, Louise, in your case study, was actually an end beneficiary of a conversation or some intervention that someone in a hospital in a care facility had with her son. So it was sort of in some ways potentially an unexpected end user, but I guess everyone is part of that cohort. We've got a comment from Tamsin. Thanks for your engaging and heartfelt talk. I really enjoyed it. I want to especially thank you for highlighting the benefits of listening and how this facilitates great discussion and collaboration. I would also like to thank you for highlighting that the impact of research should be measured in many ways, not just about how much money you've been awarded, with a couple of hearts and thumbs up there as well. And Sarah has uploaded a paper that I think MIFU were involved with or co-authored, explaining the connection between good fortune and good management in collaboration. So that's up on the chat and people can download that. And then from Melissa, issues of national significance such as health, environment, cybersecurity, climate, natural hazards are applied by nature and probably more amenable to funding. Just thinking across other disciplines, other disciplines that might not be so applied and viewed as less public good, history, music, maths. What insights would you have for how all disciplines could be involved in a public good narration?
Yeah, great question. With 1 minute to go. I think it is really tricky, but I think there is always an industry that is working with you. Say, like, I don't know much about music, and I said right from the beginning in the X-FacToR whole bit, I don't know anything about singing and I can't seem to save my life. But music is a whole industry, and cultural and arts are really important. So who are the peak bodies? Who are the peak players? Who are the philanthropists who are interested in funding and supporting this? How does the Arts Council of Australia view their priorities? And where does the research fit that goes with that? Is it about development of new ways of working? Is it new programs? Is it evaluating their program? There's a whole lot of ways I think that we can think if we're looking at a bigger, longer term picture of what is this across Australia. And I guess that's my point of not just sitting at your own desk and thinking what's here and in it for me, but what are we trying to do here? And why are we trying? Why are we a university? Why are we generating new knowledge and new ways of working and new ways of thinking? So I think always looking to the policy environment, the peak body environment, and the key players in your field will help give you flags on what it is and how it is that industry is evolving, and how you might then get into that evolution.
Thanks, Miff. Thanks everyone for your great questions and comments, and for really interested participation today. It's really good. I'd like particularly thank you, Miff. It's been a fantastic presentation, and your delivery and the content has been inspiring and thought-provoking. We've recorded this, so hopefully other people will be able to view this as well, this presentation. We will be having another X-FactOR presentation coming up soon, hopefully. So any ideas for if there are teams that would either like to present or people that you'd like to hear from, please send those comments in. We might put an email address up where people can send those thoughts in. In the meantime, you could send them to dvcr@une.edu.au. But again, thanks so much, Miff, and I wish everyone a great rest of the day. Thank you.